Good morning, shut-ins. When last we spoke, we were discussing the first major military operations by the United States in the Vietnam conflict, with the air campaign over North Vietnam called Operation Rolling Thunder. The war would take a decisive turn within a month after the beginning of Operation Rolling Thunder, in March of 1965, with the arrival of the first ground combat forces in Vietnam. It was deemed that combat forces, Marines, would need to be on the ground in order to defend U.S. air bases, to protect those planes that would be taking off and bombing North Vietnam in Rolling Thunder. But there were some concerns that an increase in U.S. troops would begin to undermine the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, the South Vietnamese Army, and their efforts to carry out the war, and that the United States would be taking on a greater and greater burden. The belief was that additional troops, combined with Operation Rolling Thunder, would convince the North that they could not win and would force them into a negotiation that would be favorable towards the South Vietnamese and the United States. So in March of 1965, the first combat troops arrived. The first combat Marines would arrive in Vietnam. In the beginning months, the strategy for these Marines was what's known as the exclave strategy. It's basically just allowing U.S. troops to only move within 50 miles of their bases. And this was to limit the commitment of American troops and to make sure the South Vietnamese were still carrying out the majority of the combat. This would be abandoned quite early, however, as it proved that 50-mile radius would not be successful in stemming the attacks from Viet Cong forces. So with increased U.S. numbers in South Vietnam, the ARVN was leaving more of the war for the Americans to fight. In July of 1965, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense for President Johnson, recommended the escalation of ground combat operations in South Vietnam. He recommended the authorization for independent military actions, and he saw very few people, saw the opportunity for the United States to fail at this point in Vietnam. The hope was that increased troop numbers would take the North Vietnamese to a breaking point, but no one knew exactly where that breaking point was going to be. In 1965, the United States would have over 100,000 troops in Vietnam, and you can see here that will dramatically escalate in the next couple years to over 500,000 troops by 1968, peaking at 535,000. So we've got a massive American force in South Vietnam, and remember, still fighting with South Vietnamese army, versus a guerrilla army in South Vietnam with no clear front line. So this is a very different war than Korea or World War II or World War I, where there were definitive front lines in the combat. We don't see the same in Vietnam. The American strategy, 1965, 66, into 67 and 68, is going to be one of attrition. The hope would be that the United States would be able to simply grind down Viet Cong forces and North Vietnamese army forces to the point where they would be forced into negotiation. The United States was looking for body counts as they went on what are known as search and destroy missions, where platoons of troops would march off into the desert, or off into the jungle, and they would just look for the enemy. And if they found them, they would fire upon them, and then they would count up those that they killed, and they would report those numbers back. So this strategy of collecting body counts in hopes that creating a large number of enemy dead would ultimately lead to war is what the United States was assuming here. It was put by one Marine who was one of the first to arrive in Vietnam, Phil Caputo, who later went on to become a writer. He said, with regard to these body counts, if it is dead and it's Vietnamese, it's Viet Cong. And this just kind of gave the notion that these soldiers really had no idea who was the Viet Cong or who wasn't. And if their superiors were looking for body counts, they were going to give them body counts. They had no way of knowing whether the people they were killing were in fact Viet Cong or not. This is going to turn out to be a failed strategy, as the United States dramatically underestimates the Vietnamese capacity for their losses. And this goes back to what Ho Chi Minh would have said during the First Indochina War. that against the French, the Vietnamese could lose 10 men for every one Frenchman, yet they would still keep on fighting. And this seemed to be true in the American portion of the war as well. So as the search and destroy missions turn out to be a failure, the Americans are not taking over any more ground in South Vietnam. The initial belief that the insurgency in the South could stop within 18 months is proving to not work out. As these troops are entering into more combat in South Vietnam, more artillery fire and air support will be directed on South Vietnam than in the North. And in fact, through the course of the war, 2/3 of all bombs dropped during the Vietnam War would fall on South Vietnam. And this is going to pose problems for the Americans as well, as we were hoping to win the hearts and the minds of those in South Vietnam while bombing their countryside. So this is putting great stress on the citizens of South Vietnam and forcing many of them to flee into the cities where there's already severe problems of overcrowding. The Americans are using helicopters to provide for air mobility to get troops deep into the jungle, but the guerrilla forces they're fighting against have excellent ground mobility as well as some support from the peasant populations. As our troops are finding it difficult at times to find the enemy, the United States will begin to use herbicides like Agent Orange to defoliate the jungle. This is a chemical that would burn the leaves off of the trees, so enemy troops would be easier to spot. And we'll talk later about the long-term effects of Agent Orange, both on American soldiers and more dramatically on the Vietnamese population. The United States was continuously searching for this theoretical crossover point where communists would be forced to capitulate and give in to negotiations. Yet this never worked out. So this American strategy of attrition certainly prevented the defeat of the Americans and the South Vietnamese, but it did not achieve any victory. From 1965 to 1967, 179,000 Communist soldiers were lost, Viet Cong or North Vietnamese Army, compared to 13,500 Americans and 49,000 South Vietnamese troops. So a dramatic tilt in the favor of the Americans and the South Vietnamese in terms of body counts, but there is still, as time is going on, an increase in communist troop levels. The United States simply cannot kill enough Vietnamese, enough North Vietnamese or Viet Cong to turn the tide of the conflict. So the quest for body counts did not gain any territory and did not deny the enemy of any areas of support, so they ultimately did not work. To further exacerbate the problems for the Americans and the South Vietnamese, with all the bombs being dropped on South Vietnam, there's going to be a great number of unexploded bombs that can be used by the guerrillas as explosives themselves and eventually used against Americans and South Vietnamese. Extensive bombing in the South would kill numerous civilians and disrupt their agriculture, forcing refugees into the cities and causing further instability for the government of South Vietnam. As the war pressed on, there's going to be a growing anti-war movement that would start with the earliest bombing in 1965 and obviously grow in the years after that. It would become one of the largest social movements in United States history. Growing out of an already existing civil rights movement and anti-nuclear war movement, this anti-Vietnam War movement would be one of the largest that the United States would see to this point. There's many factions within this anti-war movement. Liberals, radicals, leftists that actually supported the government of North Vietnam, those that wanted to just see the end of the conflict. The draft, the military draft, where young men would have to register for a draft lottery, and if your number was pulled out of a hopper, you had the privilege of going to Vietnam. The draft would exacerbate this anti-war activity, with many Americans, most Americans to be sure, actually going to, doing what their duty was and actually going to war when they were drafted. But there will be a number of conscientious objectors, those that for some reason, maybe religious affiliation, maybe just what's in their conscience, make the attempt to avoid going to war, and in some cases successful. One unsuccessful case would, of course, if you know the story of Cassius Clay or Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali claimed conscientious objector status and took his case to court and ultimately lost and ended up serving jail time when he otherwise would have been the heavyweight champion of the world. The largest rally would come in October 21st of 1967 in Washington, D.C. at the Lincoln Memorial. These were massive rallies, but they would never enjoy widespread popularity across the country. There's great association of these anti-war protests with the counterculture generation that the majority of Americans just did not want to be seen with. And then there's also displays of North Vietnamese flags and paraphernalia like that were distasteful to most Americans. So the anti-war movement would never enjoy widespread popularity, and you can see by this chart right here that it wouldn't be until 1968, so well into the course of our war, that the majority of Americans would start to see it as a mistake to send American troops into war. So I don't want you to have the impression that from the outset the Vietnam War was a wildly unpopular war. It took a few years and a major event that we'll talk about next. During the course of this escalation in Vietnam, we are going to start to see more debates in Washington, D.C. About the success of the war. Now, this is General William Westmoreland, who would report back to the president in 1967 that we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, and that just continued operations and a continued escalation of American troops would tip the balance towards the Americans and the South Vietnamese and force the North Vietnamese into negotiations. So this is in 1967, and obviously that is not going to be successful. We're going to start to see some high-level officials in the Johnson administration start to question continued American involvement in the war. Robert McNamara himself, the Secretary of Defense, who was one of the earliest to advocate escalation in Vietnam, would himself turn against the war and ultimately resign from his position as Secretary of Defense. But President Johnson held with the course and would continue to escalate our troop numbers in Vietnam while peppering the American public with positive reports of the war. And here again, we have to remember, this is 1967, leading into 1968, and we know that in 1968 there's an election on the way. So President Johnson, if he were to choose at that point to run for re-election, he's got that to deal with. So he, of course, will not run for re-election, but in 1967, that is not clear that he won't run for re-election. Now, the greatest turning point in the Vietnam War comes in the end of January in 1968 with an event known as the Tet Offensive. Now, the Tet Offensive is a massive offensive by North Vietnamese forces and Viet Cong forces launched on what is known as Tet, the Vietnamese New Year. The Lunar New Year in Vietnam. So it's one of the most important holidays in Vietnam. The goals of this Tet Offensive by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, they were definitely worried that they could not continue to take the losses that they were taking. The Americans were still bombing the North, we were bombing the South, we were striking throughout the country against Viet Cong forces. This was in large part a desperate last offensive by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. The hope was as well to stimulate popular uprisings in the South, much like the Americans attempted with the Bay of Pigs invasion, with starting a major revolution in Cuba. We had hoped that would spark local uprisings, which never happened. While the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese are hoping that this will start popular uprisings against the war in the South. Further hope was to disrupt the Republic of Vietnam's government, South Vietnam's government, and to force ultimately an American withdrawal, or at least an end to the bombings. So the plan for the Tet Offensive would be to lure American troops away from the cities and away from their bases into the countryside with diversionary tactics, leaving the cities vulnerable. And then, following that, the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong would launch attacks against all of South Vietnam's major cities. So the diversionary attacks would come centered around the city of Quezon Son in the northwest portion of South Vietnam to draw American troops away. And the second stage was to launch the offensive on Tet, on the Tet holiday. Typically, this day was a mutual ceasefire in the course of the war, but on January 30th, 1968, 84,000 troops, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army, attacked the most important urban areas and military bases in the South, including capturing the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The aftermath of this attack, which was almost a complete surprise for the Americans and the South Vietnamese, was that it was not a success at all for the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong. The communist forces were not coordinated. There was not much organization between their attacks. The United States was given time to reinforce weaker areas. The popular uprising that the communists had hoped to gain never amounted. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam fought more effectively than the United States would have ever expected them to be able to do. Communists were driven out of almost all of the cities that they had attacked within a few days. So this was not at all a military victory for the communist forces. They lost over 30,000 men, almost half of their original engagement force, compared to 3,500 American and South Vietnamese forces. Some rural areas would fall back into communist control, but there is one aspect that makes the Tet Offensive remarkably successful for the communists, and that is that it would break the American pattern of escalation in Vietnam. So up to this point, and if you recall, we can go back to this chart. Up until 1968, the United States, and especially from 1965 to 68, is going to see dramatic escalation in troop numbers. 1968, with the aftermath of the Tet Offensive, will end that, and the United States will begin to draw down their troops following the Tet Offensive. In addition, American media is going to have a dramatic impact on the perception of what Tet meant and what it would mean for American involvement in the war. It awakened Americans to the realities of the war because, prior to this, most of the combat was American troops going off into the jungle. Now the Army actually went to the urban areas where media had such a larger role. This proved that, unlike what Westmoreland had said before, there was no light at the end of the tunnel. If the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese could put on an attack like this, how close were they really to the end of their ability to fight? Media reports would shock Americans who were told that the war was being won. Images like this horrible image of a South Vietnamese police commander assassinating a Viet Cong prisoner on the streets of Saigon would dramatically impact how Americans would view what we're doing in Vietnam and who we're doing it for. Ultimately, General Westmoreland would use the Tet Offensive as an excuse to attempt to further escalate, even into the countries of Laos and Cambodia, but President Johnson would reject this. The American media began to take an increasingly unfavorable view towards the war, and misperceptions that the Tet Offensive was a North Vietnamese victory were rarely challenged by the media. And you see here, this is Walter Cronkite, who was by far the most familiar face for Americans, delivering the news to Americans every night. He would deliver some of the most influential comments with regard to the Tet Offensive in shaping the American public's perception of the war, when he said, "To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe in the face of evidence the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest that we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic yet unsatisfactory conclusion. On the off chance that the military and political analysts are right, in the next few months we must test the enemy's intentions, in case this is indeed his last big gasp before negotiations. But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out will then be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could." This is Walter Cronkite. Good night. And to all of you, do your best to stay warm. Hopefully I see you tomorrow or the next day or the next day. This will be the only lecture that I will do like this for now. If we are out of school tomorrow, expect another one. Certainly tomorrow and Wednesday, expect another one within the next couple days. I'm also going to be emailing you a practice paper too that I would love you to have taken care of by the next time we meet. I'm sure you'll all understand that while we would love to completely take all these days off, we have exams coming and time is getting short. So I hope this isn't too much for you. I know it doesn't replace what we can do in the classroom, but for now it's going to be the best we can do. Stay warm. Talk to you later.